This is a Seattle Parks and Recreation project, and the staff there are David Graves and Katie Bang, both of whom are here this evening, and they are leading the project for the Parks Department. Also, the Freeway Park Association has been a very essential partner in this effort from the beginning. And Risa Conklin and Christina Kim. Risa is the executive director here this evening, and Christina is her support on outreach. Our presentation tonight is going to be by Lara Rose, who is from Walker Macy. She's the lead designer for this project, and she will be giving you an overview of the work they have been doing to date. And then Brice Maryman is going to moderate the panel of Helphand experts, and he will be introducing them once they get started. And also, I'd like to acknowledge the work of the advisory committee as well. They've been helping with reviewing work in this process, and they represent a whole array of organizations and interests, and that has been really valuable in lending their insights to the project as it's being discussed. And also, we have other consultants in the room. If they care to put up their hands, a number from the team are here tonight as well. I can barely see, but there are some arms out there, so that's a good sign. As you listen to the presentation and to the panel this evening, will you please write any questions you have on the cards that you received as you came in the door this evening? And around 7:30-ish, I'm going to step back up here for a moment and then ask that you all pass those cards to the end so that we can pick them up and organize them so that we can have them be part of the Q&A. And finally, we have a survey which you picked up this evening as you came in. And if you will complete that survey, that would be very helpful to us. The cover sheet you can tear off if you want to keep information about the website and other things about the program. But that would be helpful if you would rather do so online. It is up and posted to the site now, and we will also have the exhibit material will be up and available. Now I would like to introduce Jesús Aguirre, who's the superintendent of the Seattle Parks and Recreation Department, who's going to say a few words.
Good evening. I can't see anyone. I feel like I should do a stand-up comedy routine, but they would all be really dumb dad jokes, so I'll spare you. But I'm really excited to be here today. I also want to echo some of the appreciation for some of the folks in the room. So certainly the Freeway Park Association, all the members of the advisory committee, all of the consultants and the design team participants. I also want to do a quick shout out to all of the Seattle Parks and Recreation Planning and Development team. There's a bunch of folks here. I know we mentioned David Graves and Katie Bang. I know Karen O'Connor is here, but everyone from Seattle Parks and Recreation, raise your hand, and at least I'll applaud you, but let's give them a big round of applause. So I call them out because these folks every day go out and engage with community and design and build and plan for really cool projects, and this is one of the really cool ones. So I want to thank them for all of their work. So I'm excited to be here today as we engage with all of you, as we engage with the community to really sort of have conversations about what the future Freeway Park is going to look like. I didn't know that there were Helphand experts, but I guess it's because I'm not an architect. But as you all know, this park was designed by Lawrence Helphand, opened July 4th of not 1776. That may get a really cool park. It would have been hard to lid over a freeway in 1776, but 1976. And you know, it was the first park in the United States that incorporated a lid over an interstate highway, which I think is a really important part of the conversations that we're continuing to have. So truly, it's a feat of architecture, a feat of engineering, and of course, a community jewel. And it's one of the most important parks, one of the more important parks in the Seattle Parks and Recreation inventory. So we're excited to have you all here today at Seattle Parks and Recreation. We're really committed to engaging in an ongoing discourse with our community as we think about, as we plan for the needs of all of our residents in this city that's changing so much. So events like this, open houses, community engagement, is really about helping us ensure that whatever projects we put together, whatever we build, whatever initiative we plan and implement is done with community input, and it's done with a robust and culturally responsive community outreach. So the work that we do is on behalf of our residents. We want to make sure that we're engaging in conversations with all of you as we do that. So we want to thank everyone for being here today. I know there's a lot of Helphand experts and Freeway Park experts, but there's a lot of folks here who are here to learn, and thank you for coming and expressing interest in this really historic project. And also thank you for sharing your feedback. Your input is going to be really critical to the work that we're doing as we continue to explore how Freeway Park can best serve the changing needs of our city and this really increasingly diverse community. I want to thank also our expert panel that you'll meet here in a minute. I also want to thank Brice Maryman, who I haven't seen him in the room, but I know he was a former Parks and Recreation Board Commissioner. Where's Brice? Right in front of me. There, that's why I didn't see you. Thank you for your work today. Thanks for your contribution. So you'll learn from a lot of the experts here in the room: landscape architects, landscape history architects, cultural landscape experts, preservation experts, and they're all going to help and have discussions about the significance of this park, how it relates to the present day social issues that are facing us, as well as generally the challenges and opportunities that are facing urban parks today. So I'm really excited to learn as well about this park along with you and for this lively discussion. So before I close, I do want to take a moment to honor Jim Ellis. So as you all know, Jim Ellis was a lifelong civic leader that was involved and led to the effort that created not only Freeway Park, but several other just truly significant and impactful initiatives here for Seattle and for the Pacific Northwest. As you may know, the park was renamed in 2008 to be the Jim Ellis Freeway Park. And so sadly, Jim passed away last week. So he's going to be in our thoughts tonight as we envision what the future of his beloved park will look like. So again, thanks so much for coming, and thanks so much for sharing your ideas and your perspectives.
Thank you, Jesús, and thank all of you for coming. So as Jesús mentioned, the park opened to the public in 1976, repeating that mistake. It was the result of an extraordinary vision by Lawrence Halpern, the landscape architect, to reconnect the city's neighborhoods across I-5. And I'm going to start just by taking us all back in time a little bit to 1 year after the park opened, and share this video. So that last spot in the video you're looking at of course, is where the convention center sits today. So incredible change since this video was made. The scope of our project is to consider all 5.2 acres of the park. That includes some areas owned by Seattle Parks and Recreation, as well as some areas owned by the convention center and neighboring property owners. We will be thinking big, but ultimately we'll need to make some thoughtful decisions about what $6 million will get us and what is most important to do here. First and foremost, we'll be repairing and restoring Freeway Park. We'll also be designing potential enhancements that ultimately are aimed at bringing people back to the park. And generally, we hope to make the park easier to use, maintain, and appreciate today. Importantly, the park has been nominated to the National Register of Historic Places. And with that in mind, we intend to approach the project with a great deal of rigor and respect. Our team has also developed a project approach that will establish a framework for all of our work going forward. First, Freeway Park is a nationally significant park and Seattle's largest downtown open space. It should be an attractive destination of the highest quality. Second, this project will honor the original design intent. Freeway Park should connect the city and bring people together. It is a tranquil place, but one with a very adventurous spirit. And third, the city and the park's physical context, as you just saw, have changed significantly over time. To ensure its ongoing use and legacy, some changes may be necessary. With that in mind, we are beginning with restoration. Luckily, many of the park's most iconic features, especially its fountains and its walls, as well as a lot of greenery in the park, remains intact, and we hope to preserve and restore these features for future generations. But a lot of the park needs repair or needs to be reconstructed. The lawns are suffering competition from tree roots over shallow soils. A lot of planting and irrigation has failed. Paving and drainage need replacement throughout. Many of the furnishings have fallen into disrepair or been vandalized, and the restrooms have been closed for many years, so the park lacks that critical park amenity. Our team has also come up with a series of 6 general observations and recommendations for the project, and we hope that some of these really shed light on what we can do to bring people back to the park. We're asking what works, what doesn't, and where we can go from here. First of all, entrances and exits to the park are very hard to find. And of course, that's ironic given that the park was really designed to fully and very clearly connect neighborhoods across I-5. These are photographs that just show an example of some of the park entrances today. And as you can see, none of these entrances do much to announce the park, tell you what's there, celebrate it, or draw you in. So this is a case where we can probably do a lot by pruning and opening up views and really encouraging people to enter the park from the streets. We also want to strengthen the entrances with the most potential. Right now, there are actually 12 entrances to the main part of the park. That is an incredibly confusing situation. It makes it very easy to sort of slip in and slip out of the park and not really have a sense of where you're going. But we think that if we look at the streets where people are today and the neighborhoods where people are actually coming from, we can heighten those entrances and really emphasize them and make them points where they capture people and interest people in coming into the park. It's worth noting that even 8th Avenue, which is that dashed line on this diagram, that's the bridge that goes over the park and connects First Hill to the convention center area. Even though it's not a great street, hundreds of people are walking along 8th Avenue in any given hour on any typical day in Seattle. And they walk right by the park entrance and don't come down those stairs. So with that in mind, we hope to really establish 4 main entrances, and these are the entrances we're proposing, the big orange dots, to really capture people. We'll also be downplaying some of the other entrances and turning them into either service or maintenance access only, or recognizing the fact that there are a number of ways to get into the park through private property. And those are all those sort of long drawn out purple lines on this diagram. If those were enriching experiences with art or lighting or gardens or botanical walks, we could really go a long way to drawing people into the park. Once you get in the park, it's perhaps equally confusing. And this is our own diagram of how people experience park circulation. You may feel the same, or perhaps not if you know the park really well. But there are all these decision points where you arrive somewhere in the park and you just don't know where to turn next. And so what we would like to do is really emphasize two main routes through the park. This isn't to say that those will be the only places you can walk, but we can make these particular connections feel much more intuitive, more generous, more open, just by thinking about things like placement of lighting, signage, and opening up view corridors along these connections. We're also really interested in linking these main park routes to park destinations. So right now, for example, Piggott Corridor brings you down into the park and completely bypasses the upper lawns. There's this wonderful park space that you would walk right past if you didn't know where you were going. And so one thing we want to do is really make sure that these circulation routes take you somewhere meaningful and somewhere exciting. Many people don't know about Freeway Park, and they don't know what it offers. And that's really a shame, because Freeway Park was meant to provide an incredible experience. You know, Halperin, the original designer, thought that he could enhance urban life by providing a unique experience that was similar to one you could have in a natural setting. He wanted it to be dramatic and immersive and really new and exciting. And many of the park spaces do have unique features, but many of us, and I think many people in the public seeing the park for the first time, it all feels the same. Part of that is because of the strong design language that carries throughout the park. But another part is that people tend to stay on the main paths. They're not venturing out and experiencing everything in the park because people don't feel invited to do so, or in some cases don't feel safe doing so. And so what we're hoping to do is, for each of these four main park spaces, really distinguish one from another, really heighten what is unique and special about each one, either in terms of a design feature like the fountains in Seneca Plaza, or ways that they support different ways they are being used today. So Seneca Plaza is by far the most dramatic space in the park. It's really all about the fountains. And we would love to make improvements that support more active use and accessible views of these fountains. Right now, this part of the park also sees the highest event use, and that's something that we think is terrific, but it lacks the infrastructure that it needs to support these events. And so with some improvements, we could really make Seneca Plaza the part of the park that sings and that is just this incredibly special, incredibly dramatic place right next to downtown. The upper lawns really have an opportunity to function more like a neighborhood park. This is the only primary park space that isn't directly connected to a street, so it's naturally more secluded. But it should be a great place to kick around a ball, have a picnic, and let your kids or grandkids, run wild and just play. Upper Seneca is perhaps the most nature-like space in the park. It has some beautiful trees and planting. It offers shade and great quiet places to sit on a bench nestled into gardens or forest. And it could, with some improvements, offer accessible and really spectacular views down into the canyon fountain. And then finally, the box gardens are perhaps our biggest challenge. This is a historic photo that you see that really lets you see the structure of what is along Seneca and 6th. And this area was designed as a buffer for the park from the freeway, but it also serves as a really iconic entrance for people who are driving into Seattle below. The challenge here is that with no specific park function, and extremely challenging maintenance, this area of the park has fallen into a great deal of disrepair. We're asking some pretty big questions here in this part of the park. Things like, what could we do to bring a new user group to this area? Could it include a skate park designed for kids? Could it include a dog park? Could it be a site for world-class art or curated gardens? We think it needs some big moves and some big thinking to really make it succeed. Our next observation is that the park has many barriers, both physical and perceived. And so we've mapped the biggest barriers, shown in gray here. In some cases, these barriers are streets, where a simple crosswalk improvement or an ADA ramp could go a long way. In other areas, they're park features themselves, and in those cases, we'll be looking at opening up views or providing access to the edges of those features. And most importantly, we really want to establish connections across the whole park, help and design the park with the idea that people would experience the whole thing, and that you would have short, medium, as well as long views. And so we're particularly interested in restoring some of those views, like the one down University Street, that would let people orient themselves not only to the park, but also to the city and to our regional landscape at large. And there are actually multiple locations in the park. This one is at 8th Avenue, the entrance from 8th Avenue, where by clearing, perhaps lowering a wall, or changing the way a stair arrives in the park, we could really change the sense of arrival and provide a dramatic experience that no one knows is there. And a similar opportunity exists at the top of Piggott Corridor. We're also going to be looking at improving accessibility in the park. For those of you who know it, you know intuitively that Seneca Plaza is a lot lower than the rest of the park. It's 15 feet lower, in fact, and there's no easy way to create an accessible connection apart from the sidewalk on Seneca itself. With that in mind, we think equitable access and safe access to both areas of the park is very, very important. And so we'll be encouraging Seattle Parks and Recreation to work with SDOT and other partners to provide places where you could drop someone off who's in a wheelchair and really make sure that we're lending the park experience to everyone in our community. There are also not many kids or families in the park. And this is an especially disappointing state given the fact that the park really was designed to attract youth. Helphand and his design team thought of it as this vibrant, energetic space. And right now, this is a view from the Cascade Fountain looking towards the Canyon Fountain. But because this space has become so sort of overgrown, it feels like a back corner of the park. It doesn't get there's no sunlight anymore on the water. No one would use this space today the way it was used many years ago. We think there are two great places in the park where we could really encourage play and exploration. One is in the Cascade Fountain and Seneca Plaza area, where by bringing more light into the plaza, looking at accessibility for both fountains, and really integrating these spaces in a more coherent way, we could encourage that. We could bring back that playful nature of the park. And then the upper lawns as well has some great features, small fountains and small concrete features, that if we integrated some nature play ideas or encouraged people to circulate around that area in a different way, it might completely change its use and turn it from being what feels like a dead end in the park to being this exciting destination. The park is also no longer as comfortable as it should be. Some areas have very limited visibility and lack of use, like the underpass under 8th. It's interesting to think what we could do here to enliven it, whether that's art or lighting installations or an active building use of some kind. There are also parts of the park that have blocked views and perceived hiding spots, areas of deep shade, and a lot of areas of just misuse, where because there's not active people enjoying the park, they become neglected and fall into disrepair. And we would like to really look carefully at all of these issues and improve them as much as we can. Park lighting is a really important piece of comfort. Right now, the situation is that the park paths are actually quite well lit, but the rest of the park is dark. And that is very different from the way it was designed. The park path lighting is actually not original to the park design. What used to be there were tall mast lights and uplights that would have provided this sort of magical ambient lighting where you could appreciate the whole park space. And though we may have to use some different lighting strategies that the Parks Department can maintain well, we would really like to bring back what we're calling layers of light and really capture the whole space and celebrate features like the fountains with new lighting. And finally, programming brings a lot of people to the park, but the park's design really poses challenges. So Freeway Park Association has done a fantastic job sponsoring a whole range of events, from daily, small-scale activation, games they put out for kids, to seasonal events and performance series, and then special events or events that are associated with various holidays or festivals in the city. All of those types of uses require infrastructure. And right now, Freeway Park Association is relying on temporary facilities, like the porta potty, like these maintenance sheds. And we think that those are the types of things that, though they fill a need, really detract from the sense that you are in a high-quality downtown park space. So we would like to see these needs met, but replaced with high-quality features that are well integrated into the park's design. The way that programming works today, it occurs in two spaces. It occurs in Seneca Plaza, down low, and also in the upper lawns. We have a closed restroom, and again, especially in Seneca Plaza, very limited infrastructure to support the kinds of events that have been so successful there. And so we think that this park, partly because of that challenge in accessibility and the fact that it really feels like two parks spatially in some ways, could deserve two small park buildings that both would include a park concierge, someone who could act as a park host, welcome people, share information about the park, as well as restrooms and storage to support the ongoing use and activation of this space. So those are all of our observations. They have led us to very specific design ideas for all of the focus areas shown here. And so this is really meant to just be a teaser. We are not going to go into our design concepts in depth. We're actually going to turn the discussion over to our panel of helper and experts. But I would encourage all of you, if you haven't yet, to go peruse the boards or to look online, fill out our survey, and let us know what kind of park improvements you would be most excited by. So with that, I'm excited to introduce our panel moderator, Brice Maryman, who helped author the 2005 City of Seattle Landmark nomination for the park, and he's also been deeply involved with Freeway Park for many years. We're also really excited to have a group of panelists who are experts on Lawrence Halprin, and although their views are independent from our design team, we really are excited about the ways their perspectives will help inform our work. Brice.
Come on up, panel. It is such an important time to be having this conversation just 7 years short of the 250th anniversary of the park. It's truly remarkable. Thank you, Seattle Parks Town Hall, and everyone here coming out tonight for engaging in this conversation. For those of you who think you might want to go into landscape architecture, you probably have this bucolic idea that you get to spend every day outdoors talking about big ideas about the importance of public space. I'm here to burst your bubble and say most of it is doing CAD behind a computer, but every so often you have an amazing day like this afternoon where you actually get to do what you dreamed you could do and have a wonderful conversation with 6 amazing people out in this amazing public space. So I haven't introduced our panel yet, and that is because I'm going to let them introduce themselves as they introduce their connection to Freeway Park. So earlier today, as I said, we had the opportunity to walk around Freeway Park, observe it, listen to the design team's point of view, and I'd love to hear the panelists talk about what your connection to the park is and what made an impression on you today. And we'll maybe start on the end with Randy.
On? There it is? Okay, there we go. All right. Hi, my name is Randy Gragg. I am currently the director of the Portland Parks Foundation, and I was one of the people behind a recent $4.5 million restoration of the Portland open space sequence in Portland, which was Halpern work that just sort of immediately preceded Freeway Park for interconnected plazas and the city's first urban renewal area. And but I lived in Seattle in the 80s and started visiting in the late 70s, and I remember quite vividly my first experience with Freeway Park, which was on psilocybin. One of my first visits to the city. And I remember being particularly just riveted by the window looking at the freeway through the fountain. It was just like, I'm from Reno, Nevada. You know, Seattle was kind of the first, well, San Francisco was the first big city, but Seattle was the first my first experience of living in a city. And it just seemed like a giant playground to me. You know, the mountains and everything, but then this crazy park in the middle of it, and you could, you know, ride your bike on the freeway on a certain Sunday, you know, and in those days, and you know, it was just kind of part of this whole world. But I still remember so vividly this idea of a park, not anything I had ever really understood to be a park, over a freeway, and then you're looking at the freeway through a fountain. And so I went back there today, as I have a few other times, and that view is no longer there. So hopefully we can do something about that. Anyway, I'll pass it along now.
Hi, I'm Alison Hirsch, the Director of Landscape Architecture graduate program at USC. And I've been working on Halpern's work for a very long time. I have a degree in landscape architecture, but also historic preservation, and that's actually the moment where I really got invested in his work. I did that degree at University of Pennsylvania, where Halpern's papers are. So I've been deeply immersed in that archive. It culminated in a book. I saw Kenny brought his book, so I felt like I needed to do a little my own self-promotion. But what I want to note about the book, it's called City Choreographer. The book is really predominantly about Larry Halpern's collaborations with his wife, who is a still active dancer and choreographer, and really focused on their collaborative process and how her work influenced his. But I also want to note that, you know, that the cover of the book is Seattle Freeway Park. The book is not just about process, but about how the process manifested real form, and you know, there's a Cascade Fountain with children playing in it. Today, you know, I've always had a deep affection for Seattle Freeway Park. It actually is, I think, my very favorite of Halpern's work. But to sort of repeat what Randy was saying, I mean, the counterpoint that it provides, the sort of power of the freeway, is so powerful itself, and yet, you know, I've been hearing some language being thrown around about it being a respite, and that was really never the intention of the park. I mean, the park was intended to be a sort of counterpoint to the power of the infrastructural move of sort of cutting through the city. And so, I mean, the connection to the freeway is really degraded, and I think that that's something that needs to be reignited. You know, today, obviously we didn't see the water on, so there was that disappointment too. But I think that, you know, the real sort of impetus for the project was the freeway, and so that connection needs to be strengthened.
Can you repeat the name of your book?
Yes. City Choreographer, Lawrence Halpern in Urban Renewal America. So it's largely about the context in which the park and his work in that period were coming to fruition.
My name is Charles Birnbaum. I am the president and founder and CEO of the Cultural Landscape Foundation in Washington, D.C. I practiced landscape architecture in New York for about 11 years, and then in 1992 I set federal policy at the National Park Service for 15 years. The guidelines for the treatment of cultural landscapes, which were mentioned in the RFP for this work, I served as a co-author of. First of all, I want to thank Seattle Parks and Recreation for inviting us people from back east to come here this evening. I have been coming to Freeway Park for many years. I first became aware of Larry Halpern's work, like so many of my generation, when I was a student, and Halpern's watercolor drawings were traveling to Syracuse at the Everson Art Museum it was about '76, so it was about the year that the park opened. And I quickly made a pilgrimage to see the works. And I have been coming here for many decades. And what was interesting these last trips, I was here in the spring as well, is to see the park, to be in the park when there is no water on, and to really become aware of the ambient sound, the noise of the freeway, which you really didn't notice before. And so for me, I feel that there's been this sort of process that's been going on for a long time here. I interviewed Larry in 2003. And at that time, a number of his projects, a number of which are in Alison's book, were on the chopping block, and in particular Skyline Park. And some of those didn't have happy endings. Some of those became the kind of Penn Station, if you will, of Halpern's legacy, that we had to get it wrong at Penn Station to save Grand Central. And I remember after the tragic death that had taken place in the restroom here of a person, there was a knee-jerk reaction, and there was a quest to remove a third of the canyon fountain and open it up, and now that's 14 years ago. And to sit here today in this presentation and to see the aspirations of the design team and the city working in collaboration with the nonprofit, it feels like a very exciting moment. I want to end my too long remarks, and I apologize, with a quote by Larry, because I feel like he is in the room, and I think probably the only Larry Halpern expert is Anna Halpern, just for the record. We're merely ambassadors. But I think the real question here is, I remember as a student that this was the first time outside of Olmsted that I thought a work of landscape architecture can be a work of art. And I want to pose the question this evening is, are we dealing with a landscape that is also a work of art? And for that, I'll just quote Mr. Halpern from 2003. I think there's no question that I'm influenced by a lot of painters and sculptors, but for me, the fact that landscape is an art involves the fact that it's an art whose need or importance is that it develops in other people a sense of creativity for themselves and artistic expression for themselves. And they react to it in a way of sensory, that's culturally and emotionally, the way any other art would affect them. When it does that, it becomes a work of art.
Is it? I guess it is on. But to follow up on what Charles just said, he was making a connection there to Olmsted. In Olmsted's writing and speaking about Central Park, he said the most essential thing was that it was a work of art, and that people would respond to it in similar ways that Charles was talking about, the way Larry wrote about and thought about his designs. My name's Kenny Helphand. I teach landscape architecture and landscape history at the University of Oregon. Some truth in advertising. Like Larry Halpern, I grew up in Brooklyn. My accent might give it away. Like Larry Halpern, I got a degree in landscape architecture from Harvard. Like Larry Halpern, I worked in San Francisco, me for a year, he for 60 years. And I taught landscape architecture, I'm recently retired, and landscape history for over 45 years. And I spent several years researching and writing a book about Halpern for a series on modern American landscape architects. The title is simple, Lawrence Halpern. Makes it easier. Thank you. But perhaps most important for me is the fact that one reason I became a landscape architect was that I was inspired by the work of Lawrence Halpern. And I think I know I'm in fact one of many. I moved to Oregon in the Pacific Northwest in 1974. I visited Freeway Park when it was brand new. So those, I wasn't, that marvelous movie, didn't see it that active the days I visited it, but I remember when it was brand new and you could see the plan. I went up in surrounding buildings so I could take pictures of it, and I have followed it ever since. I have pictures of my children, who are now in their 40s, in Freeway Park from when they were little at different stages in their life as they matured and as largely the vegetation in the park has matured. The park's no longer new, but if anything, I think its innovative character and design have been amplified over time. I made a little list today of what Freeway Park is. Freeway Park is a park. Freeway Park is a series of fountains. Freeway Park is a water garden. Freeway Park is a hanging garden. It is, I think, also a great work of sculpture and environmental art. It is a piece of urban and transportation infrastructure. It's a pedestrian bridge. It's a playground. It is a retreat. And it isn't a city icon, and I think ought to be. In my hotel room today, I had Visit Seattle. And it's pages and pages of all the wonderful things to do in Seattle, and there's the Space Needle and Pike Place Market, and et cetera, et cetera. There's not one word in here about Freeway Park. Not one word, unless it's buried somewhere in a recipe. And I think dramatically, and I suspect many of you feel this way, that it ought to have the recognition locally, nationally, and I think internationally that it deserves.
Then I don't have to learn how to turn it on.
There we go.
It's already on. It's already on. I'm Ian Robertson, and I'm a professor of landscape architecture at the University of Washington. And I was involved with Freeway Park in a replanting plan about 20 years ago. And I got to go down and talk to Hirsch about his views of what the plants should be in the park. And so my particular interest in coming here tonight and speaking to you is the plants themselves. And I think that if there's any expertise that I'm going to voice, it'll be discussion of the plants. Go back.
Okay. So I think each of you referenced a previous visit to the park in some particular way. And I wanted to draw that out a little bit because we are talking about change and how we manage change in a place that resists change. So are there things from that first visit that you would preserve? And you've already alluded to some of those things. And kind of the flip side of that same question that I wanted to ask is, are there things that after today's visit you appreciate the seeds of that choreography and how they've matured over time? Kind of a both and in that question. Ian, maybe start with plants with you.
Yes. Now I have to learn how to operate. Okay. I think the one thing that I would like to see happen is us think of Freeway Park as a window box, not a city-scaled window box. Window box, not just a park, because I think one of the things that really is missing in the park now that was there before was its youthfulness. And I think the youthfulness is something that is immensely valuable. And so I would love to see us think in terms of the plants as plants that are traded out fairly frequently. And that would solve some of the problems that I've heard you speak about, Lara Rose, about the shade, about the screening, etc. So I would like to see us think dynamically of the youthfulness of the plants and the age of the structures.
I'll take moderator's prerogative and ask Charles to respond to that, because plants are one of those historic character-defining features that the National Register says you should be looking at and paying attention to. Is Ian's idea of an interchangeable window box, is that square with that? Is that a contrast there?
Are you saying it's a square window box? I don't know if
a round tree in a square window box. Yeah.
I think what's always interesting to me when I sort of parachute into a place is people want to ask you, what's your idea for X, or what do you think of Y? And I think that what we're talking about here is a language. And whether we're applying that language to plant materials or to the fountains and hardscape, or to signage and lighting, all things that we looked at earlier, that people like Olmsted and Halpern, when they looked at a work of landscape architecture, they looked at it as a totality. And so when we now come back to bring these places back, to manage change with continuity, how do we do that in a way that honors that design intent? And I think that when we move away from that, the landscape will tell us. So for example, when Battery Park City was created, and Laurie Olin, who worked for Rich Haig and who was here, you know, in the 60s and 70s, his terminology for the fixtures was they had to have a New Yorkishness that drew upon Olmsted and Robert Moses era and Clark and Rapuano. Halpern's doing the same thing. And so the thing that I would say, Brice, in answering your question, which it seems like I'm not, but I like to think that I am.
I know you'll get there eventually.
Is that whether it's beginning large and looking at the visual and spatial qualities of a place, or whether it's looking at the individual features, whether it's hardscape or softscape or living or non-living, that we have to look at this place holistically when we look at how we prescribe change. And so the last thing I'll say to this point, and something I mentioned earlier in the group, is when we looked at the PowerPoint earlier, and we see things like entrances and wayfinding, what we should do, and Brice, you used this in the question when you set it up, you used the word choreography, that we should sort of think about this in a way that this was conceived, in a way that Halpern applied a design process with his RSVP cycles and his motation and movement, and then use that as a series of lenses to look at plant materials, to look at the fountains, to look at lighting and signage, and all of those things. So it results in something that is a symphonic way to manage change with continuity.
I'm going to say something about the plant material. I mean, I agree that that's a proper lens through which to understand and plan for change or potential change. I think there were, and I'm sort of asking Ian, because I mean, I think there were fundamental planting concepts that drove the planting design that I think should be respected. I mean, in terms of there being sort of an upland and lowland that were correspondent to the actual sort of elevation of each portion of the park. I mean, Gene Walton, who was a plant designer in Halpern's office, talked about planting rhododendrons, azaleas, alders in the lower portion in Seneca Plaza and around, and then Douglas fir and upland trees in the mountain meadow is what it was called, in the upper, what we're calling the upper lawn. So I mean, I think that that's why I was asking, we went on this walk today, and I was asking, you know, how much actually had been altered in terms of park additions and through time in the plant material, because I think there is sort of a fundamental concept behind really corresponding to elevational change in the broader regional context that I think would, you know, it would make sense to respond to and as we look forward. Do you want me to answer the rest of the question too? Or just
That was great.
because you had said, what would you preserve?
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, I was sort of thinking, what are my priorities if I was to tackle this place? You know, with $6 million, I know that's a limited budget, but, you know, for me, you know, as I already mentioned, the relationship to the freeway is primary. It was the catalyst for why this place exists. It is the first lid over an park lid over an interstate highway. It is a predecessor to other really interesting infrastructural designs here in Seattle, like Olympic Sculpture Park. So, you know, just like Randy was saying, you know, that relationship to the freeway, that is as simple as it seems, as, you know, taking out the metal mesh and the graffiti and actually bringing you in direct encounter with the cars that are going by through the fountain is you know, a very simple intervention, but it really brings to light what the real impetus for the project is. I mean, I was going to go into this later with other questions, but, you know, it just, you know, there's so many right now, there's so many park lids being planned throughout the country, and Charles already numbered that. It was over 200, I think. And very few of them actually make any reference to the infrastructure on which they're being built. And, you know, what was so interesting and experimental and innovative was that he was, I mean, I brought my copy of Freeways written by Lawrence Halpern. Sorry, I don't have the dust jacket, so you can't really see. But, you know, he was really interested in the freeway itself as a sort of form of environmental sculpture, and how could you how could you create this sculptural counterpoint to the power of that infrastructure that was being inserted into cities, imposed into cities with, without any sort of real care in the 1950s and 60s. And so, I think that window, but also the relationship of the freeway driver to the park is also really important. And Lara talked about that in the presentation. Is I know the box gardens are sort of in question right now because they're for a number of reasons, but the scales of perception that Angela Donajeva, who was the primary designer under Halperin, she really talks about these different scales of perception. And so the sort of the big heavy forms are over the freeway, and they're intended for that fast-moving car, and they really give a sense of entryway into Seattle. I think it's a really unique experience to be driving, although I've not done it in a long time, but driving on I-5 and seeing the sort of hanging forest above you. So I think that those relationships, again, to the freeway, but also from the perception of the driver, are important. And the fountains, the water, and the fountain lighting, I also think are important, but I won't go into it, and the plantings.
All of it.
Well, in thinking about this, I think I have to disagree a little bit with some of the words that have been used today. Artwork to me, and I come, not to play one-upsmanship or something, but I wrote on art for many years, and an artwork to me is something that's kind of sacrosanct. You can't change it. And this landscape needs to change. There's no question about it, in my mind. I mean, there's a lot of issues there, but the planting is a good place to start because it is a dramatically different ecosystem than it was 50 years ago, or almost 50 years ago. Most of the park is in the shade. Seattle is a Mediterranean, increasingly in a Mediterranean climate. And so to think about anything, about the plantings not being able to change, or to try to do anything other than sort of reinterpret what Alison was saying about the sort of upland and meadow habitats, seems to me to be maybe not necessarily a good operating premise. The other thing is what we really need first is some good pruning shears to kind of figure out where things are at, because you look at those early photos, and you had vistas, you had broad vistas. Now you have these tall buildings everywhere, and so that has to be sort of taken into account too. Is how do we kind of air it out? How do we change it? In terms of what I would preserve, the hanging gardens, for certain, and that's sort of a conflicting thing because they're some of the most troubled areas on the surface, but that experience of driving into Seattle is amazing. It was, obviously everybody has that impression of it. But the other thing, the whole thing was built to be a connector between First Hill and downtown, and it doesn't feel like it's serving that purpose very well now. And so it's sort of like almost a preservation becomes kind of a double entendre. I think it has to change in order to preserve its original intent. And so how do we kind of reinterpret that urge? The other thing that I would be sort of be inclined to try to preserve is and to reinterpret as it changes is the craftsmanship. The craftsmanship of this park is amazing. The concrete pours are absolutely beautiful. And it gets, sort of put under this label of brutalism, and that's sort of a bad thing, depending on if you're, what era you're, come from. But the craftsmanship is absolutely amazing, and so every touch, every addition that is made to it, every subtraction has to be, really measured against that level of craftsmanship. I mean, this is a beautiful thing in the middle of the city, over a freeway. So what can we do to continue to manifest that as we look forward?
Back to your original question about plants. I think it should be obvious that when Halperin, who was a master designer, also incredibly knowledgeable about plants, even though he often didn't do the planting design in his office, knew that the plants were going to grow. I I mean, that's an obvious statement. So he knew that he had a sense of the scale of the plant material as it was going to grow and mature, 5, 10, 50, 100 years even. And he also had a true sense that you would, someone mentioned pruning shears, that you would modify that. You would remove some things, you would prune things, you would respond to how people performed in the park. And one of Halpern's primary ways he evaluated a design was what he called performance. Both the physical performance of the space, that it's withstood people's use, but how people use this place. And also recognizing that the performance of the space would change over time, which it dramatically has, both in terms of its context and also how people use spaces. I think you asked a question of how, from when we first encountered this compared to now, there was, I think, a first encounter, which I still think is incredibly important, a sense of surprise and discovery. It's an amazing place in the middle of a city. I mean, it looks like nothing else. And anything that's proposed to do, I think, can try to enhance that sense of discovery and surprise of of encountering this space in the middle of a city.
Hey, Brice, I'm sorry. I just want to just jump back a little bit because I got a little sidetracked on the plant question and didn't finish the original statement I was going to make. And I feel I want to just go back to a couple of comments that were made by my colleagues, because I think there's a baby elephant in the room, which is not quite as interesting as the baby bunny that we saw today, who I didn't realize that the park has a mascot. But there's definitely an opportunity for a plush in the future. But two things. The thing I wanted to say about the memory, which I neglected, is this idea of feeling and association. The evening began where we learned that the National Register nomination is moving forward for Freeway Park. Brice, your kid could almost go to college by the time your volunteer work started on this. And the thing about the National Register, there are 7 qualities. And I think, remember that this was written by architectural historians. And that number 7 is feeling and association. It's much less tangible. And those feelings and associations are not just the sound of the water, but it might be when the rhododendrons are blooming and you get this breeze that lofts up from the water. And all of this is part of something symphonic. And I want to go back to the comments about how we measure success and the values that we bring and whether or not this is a work of art. And as Alison mentioned, this is the first capped park over a freeway in the US. It's likely a National Historic Landmark candidate. There are only 75 such places out of 2,800 in America that are works of landscape architecture. And the thing about Seattle, the thing that I'm always marveling at when I come back here, is the legacy of landscape architecture for a place whose history doesn't go back to when Freeway Park was built in 1776, but nevertheless begins with 27 years of the Olmsted involvement, creating one of the most astonishing networks of parks and open spaces in the US, where scenery on a monumental scale is borrowed for the first time. And then we have the innovation that Halpern brings, that Rich Haig brings with Gasworks Park. There is no city in the US that can rival the innovation and the artistic merit of these works. And so when we look at a work of landscape architecture, that's a work of art, that managing this is no different than a work of art that is ephemeral, that decomposes, that changes, that has to be managed, and has a stewardship complexity associated with it. And we have to remember that we're dealing with something that is that great, significant work by a master, and we should respond to that accordingly.
So I wanted to let Lara respond to that discussion, but I just also wanted to let people know that there are folks in the aisles who will be collecting questions. So if you'd like to, just pass them to the folks who are walking the aisle. Both Marcy and I think Katie are collecting questions at this time. So Lara, this has been quite a robust discussion around plant materials and managing change. Are there any things that you heard tonight that you weren't thinking about that you wanted to respond to?
I think I just wanted to reiterate something that Randy touched on, which is that this idea of change being necessary in order to kind of maintain the original design intent, I think is a really interesting and complex concept. And I think this is particularly true when we talk about the way the park relates to its context and to the city at large, and the fact that people are coming from different neighborhoods than they were coming from, or different streets than they were coming from when Helphand designed the park. And so I think designing with Helphand's ideas and his vision about this wonderful sequence of spaces that you move through is right on, and we need to hold on to the design intent that you're all speaking of fiercely, and really, really try to understand what that idea was all about and what made it so special, but recognize the fact that it might need to look slightly different in certain places of the park in order to make people appreciate the park in the way that Helphand intended.
I think that idea of people in the park is certainly at the heart of Helphand's work and sort of the parks as a democratic experiment. So let's venture a little bit afar from each of your expertise as Helphand aficionados and talk about one of the challenges that the park is facing today, and that is that, like many public spaces, it has become a refuge for people who are experiencing homelessness. And it's certainly a perceived challenge for the park. Do you have any thoughts about how the renovations might bring people together that are currently experiencing homelessness with people who are more stably housed? And could this process of designing this park and inviting more people into the park help to ameliorate that situation?
Can I open that
Sure.
question? I did want to mention that as part of our design process, our team has reached out to a very broad group of park users and stakeholders in the neighborhood. That includes a group at Compass Housing that a part of our team spoke to in depth. And I think it's very important, and Brice can speak to this as well, to separate the issue of homelessness from criminality. Sometimes there are issues that overlap, when you get into topics like drug use, but they're not always one and the same. And there are a lot of people experiencing homelessness in the neighborhood who may be, trying to get back on their feet. They spend a lot of time in the park. And we've heard expressions from some of those people we've spoken to for a real desire for volunteer opportunities in the park, and a desire for the park to feel safe and welcoming, especially for the people who spend a great deal of time there. And I think that especially with Freeway Park Association's involvement and the possibility of having park concierges or other people in the park who can act as touch points and maybe provide connection to social services, there's a real opportunity to reach out to the neighborhood at large and try to engage everyone in a positive way.
A few thoughts about that. First of all, this is not a local problem, of course. This is a national and regional problem. I live in Eugene, and last week, statistics was in Eugene had the highest percentage of homeless than any city in America. So I live in a city that's been trying to deal with this for a generation, and Seattle is the same way. I wouldn't look just to the park, and I wouldn't blame the park. It's like, it's not the park's fault. In fact, the park is in some ways an answer to one of the problems. Homeless people gravitate to the park because it's relatively safe compared to other opportunities for them, being under an underpass somewhere. A couple of blocks away from the park is the public library, which has become another place where homeless people congregate because it's public and they feel safe there. So I think any ways we can think of that the park can be part of the social services of the city to help people and not put all, it's like eggs in one basket or whatever, and imagine that it's going to be a solution to things in any way. I don't know your kind of local services here and where they are and located, but often you want them located where those people are, and the park may be one of those.
Yeah, I think the key question is how do you confer dignity on people who are trying really hard and dealing with difficult circumstances. In Portland, we had an artist who's done this long-term project of working with potters and working with houseless folks to make these pots and sell them. And we had a big sale in Pioneer Courthouse Square of all of these pots. And it was an amazing thing because it wasn't just putting their stuff up for sale. It was manifested as an interaction. And so all of the people who had made the pots were there, and folks who were buying them were interacting with them and hearing stories, and it really was kind of an amazing day. And I think if you can find things like that that welcome people who are trying hard and want to tell their stories, and want to make space and safe space, that goes a long ways to utilizing the parks as Kenny is suggesting. So that's where I would go with it. It's always kind of tricky. One of the things we deal with in Portland is we have these kind of so-called rogue groups who are feeding the houseless people. And that cuts both ways. We've had a lot more drug use in the areas where those are, and a lot more difficult behavior. And so it's really, really tricky business. But I think as much as you can try to find ways to confer that dignity is really, really important.
Well, let's do one more question before we turn it over to audience questions here. I'm going to play devil's advocate here and say, what happens if we turn Freeway Park into a set of mixed-use buildings, or if we redesign Seneca Plaza to include organized sports courts, or if WashDOT needs to demolish a portion of the park to expand the highway? What have we lost? And I mean that both as a city and as a broader culture. What is the importance of Freeway Park if any of those interventions were to move forward?
I mean, you lose a local treasure, you lose a great work of art, you lose a national and I think even international landmark. People actually travel to see, designers certainly travel to see places like this, and you have it in your own backyard. Anything that's done, I would be just very careful to do it with a touch that doesn't destroy its character or in any sense trivialize it.
Yeah, I am still puzzled. I mean, every time I come back to Seattle, why it isn't respected as a sort of city icon, just like Kenny said. It just completely puzzles me because of how special a place it is. And part of me thinks it's because of, the sort of sense that it's occupied by other. But I mean, if we were to lose it, I mean, we would lose, or you would lose, I'm not here enough to say we, a sense of real fantasy and mystery in the urban environment. I mean, that was the intention largely behind it, is, this bringing a sense of wildness into what was then, rapidly changing urban surrounds. But you could probably argue now there's still sort of rapid change going on all around, and it was both intended as a counterpoint to that rapid change, but also really to provide a sense of diverse urban experiences that you wouldn't get really anywhere else. And so, I mean, I had. Halpern was, I mean, it's also a park that has an incredible amount of foresight. I mean, Halpern talked about how he and the firm, when I say he and a team, he realized that, that the city was losing its connection to its dramatic sea setting because of the construction of the Alaskan Way Viaduct, and he thought the park was a moment to provide the connection both to that setting, but also to sort of elevate the regional context of Seattle. And it also, I mean, it tells the park network of Seattle. I mean, Charles already talked about Gasworks Park, but I mean, it really sort of tells an interest. The network, the entirety of the network, tells a story of the city's infrastructural development. And I mean, the city has been really at the forefront of innovating in public space and infrastructural design. And I noted, I had actually written a quote from this document that the firm issued called Seattle Freeway Park: New Dimensions for Freeways. And they talk about it. It says, The park will act as an energizing element in an eventual large-scale system of landscape plazas, walkways, and terraces interrelating many areas of Seattle over the freeway and streets down to the waterfront. If it can continue to proliferate in size and be realized as an eventual living green skin of terraces, parks, recreation areas, and planted overhangs integrating many areas of Seattle and its waterfront over the freeways and streets, an extremely important statement about returning to a vital relationship between humans, the city, and the natural environment will have been accomplished, and other cities will take heart and follow Seattle's example. I mean, clearly that's self-promoted, but I mean, I actually think, you know, it was a catalyst. It was a starting point. And now that you're seeing the viaduct is down, the city is reclaiming its waterfront. I mean, I think, you know, if I was to suggest change, it would be to really enforce the power of that open space network and make it legible and let it tell that story of that city development. In a really, you know, sort of a narrative but really interesting and engaging way that isn't just for designers but is for really anyone who's interested in cities.
I have something really simple. You lose the seed to capping the rest of the freeway through downtown.
Well, I have to say, when Brice shared this question early on, it really pissed me off. Because I thought, you know, if we took the buildings that are icons of the same period as Freeway Park, would we even ask that question? Would it be on the chopping block? And, you know, the thing that I want to say as I thought about this question, and really wrestled with, because I thought, you know, I'm going to protest, I'm not answering that. But what I thought about, because the first question about how long I've been coming here, and you know, some landscapes, like, say, Boston City Hall or Love Park in Philadelphia, which has recently been redesigned, the public's romance with that ended a long time ago. Kind of like when, you know, Burt Reynolds' career as a leading man kind of stopped happening. And, you know, Jill Clayburgh starting over that period. And then you have places like PV Plaza, which has just been renewed and rehabilitated after 10 years. And it is because that romance with that landscape never ended. Like a lot of places, the theory of starve the patient, blame the patient played out, which we see in many cities today. But I think what's different on this visit and the one I had in the spring after not coming for a couple of years is now having the Freeway Park Association there. There were these little cues, there are little hints to that reawakening of that romance with that landscape. And, you know, we can talk about things like the book stalls, or to walk through there today and see the sweetness of those paper lanterns, which was kind of magical. I saw people on the street last night at 10 o'clock squinting in the dark, reading the signage about this public engagement that's happening now. And so I choose to answer your question, Brice, by saying that will never happen because that love is happening anew. And it's a very exciting time for the park. It's very exciting that you're all here tonight, that you're stakeholders in this process. And it's great to see what the next chapter will bring.
Ian, did you want to add anything?
Well, I was trying to avoid getting into trouble.
Well, if you're going to get into trouble, you need a mic.
You know, I really didn't want to get into trouble, but I agree with what everyone is saying, but I also disagree with what everyone is saying, because I look at the box terraces, and they just don't work. They don't work if you're on the freeway because you're busy. The great thing about the video we saw of the freeway when the park was founded was that there were crowds of people and there was nobody on the freeway. It was empty. So look at the emptiness of the freeway. I think the freeway now is intensely busy, and if you are driving north or south underneath Freeway Park, you're spending all your time trying to stay alive and get into the lane you need to be in and avoid all the traffic. So I don't think the connection to the freeway is something that if Halpern saw it today, I don't think he would necessarily say we need to have that connection that way. So in my view, the better way in which we could respect Halpern's legacy would be to say, let us be as adventurous, as audacious as he was when he conceived of the park, and let's lid over the rest of the freeway. That, to me, is a better legacy of Halpern's vision than, and my wife is there with the car key, so we've got the getaway car is ready for us to go. But I do think there's things that work and things that don't work, and the things that work we should definitely preserve and do everything we can to respect them. And the things that don't work, we should say, let's be realistic and say, is this what the right thing to do is? And those boxes, I've looked at them from down at the freeway level, and if you ever want to get a really exciting experience, get the gardener to take you down to the vault where they have to go down to turn on the irrigation system. It's terrifying to be down there. It literally is terrifying. The traffic is roaring by, the noise is horrific. So the freeway, to be treated as it is now, needs to be treated in a very bold way. So.
Well, Ian teed up perfectly one of the questions that was submitted up here, which is, as we discussed today, that there is a proposal and a study underway to lid I-5 from Denny all the way up to Spring, I believe. Will the lid I-5 project be good or bad for the park? And I think we just heard Ian's vote on that with other panelists.
I don't think we should repeat what Halpern did. I think that would be foolish. I think we should respect it. And I think anything that we can do that will reduce the noise in Freeway Park will be delightful. The Freeway Park is incredibly noisy. When we replanted the park, our goal was to try and screen things out, but to avoid having the shade that the big trees had. But screening things out doesn't screen out noise, and we need to accept the reality of the city as it is today, a much noisier, much shadier, much more corralled in by the buildings.
To answer your question, I mean, we shouldn't forget the history of this. The reason for the park is the interstate highway system, as it entered into American cities, just sliced through them and eviscerated them. They eviscerated the tissue of the city. They disconnected neighborhoods, dramatically in Seattle, but all over the country. And since then, in the last 70 years almost, cities have struggled with how to address that catastrophe. And Freeway Park was perhaps one of the boldest answers to that. And now you see other cities trying to place lids over this. Eventually, I could imagine in the future, 50 years from now, as you move through downtown Seattle, you're essentially in a tunnel because the entire thing has been, covered. Which I think would be great.
I just want to speak to the sound issue, and thinking back, and I was noticing the same in that earlier film, how few cars there were on the roads and how many people there were. And so I was trying to imagine when I heard the roar today, I found myself thinking about being at the Nasher Sculpture Center a couple of weeks ago. And the first time I went to the Nasher and I had lunch there, I sat on the rear terrace. It was before Clyde Warren Park was built. And you just heard the roar of the cars. And when you go there today and you're in the garden, you don't hear it at all. And now they're extending Clyde Warren Park as well. So there really is something to be said about that in terms of the potential benefits.
I think part of the reason we were so struck by the noise of the freeway also is because the water is turned off. But I know that happens. So, and for a number of months every year. And to respond to Ian, I do think that the integrity of the idea would be diminished if there was no window to the freeway, if you had a total disconnect to what the park was responding to. I think that lidding further would be positive for the park. That was part of the original idea. I mean, the park was actually a reduced, sort of value engineered response to what the hope was. There was originally a large lid project, at least advocated for. I don't know, I mean, the funding called for the reduced layout of it now, but I think it would be really positive. I still think that the connection to the freeway is, without any connection to the freeway, the park, I think, should be replaced entirely, because I think that is the impetus for the project. It is why it's valuable. It is why it is so remarkable in the history of landscape architectural design in the 20th century. So, I mean, I think that is primary, but I don't think that if you continued the lid, I still think that you would have moments where you could really understand that relationship. I mean, you can dip down many feet below the ground level to sort of situate yourself on the median. I think we're on the median at that point, and see the cars whizzing by. We can't do it now, but that was originally part of the experience.
Okay.
Brice, can I add one thought? Since I spent a lot of time in Seattle and know this issue well, I think that the Lid I-5 project could be great for the park, but only if it's done in a way that adds enough density that there are a lot of people moving back and forth into that park's, those future park spaces on the Lid as well as into Freeway Park. One thing that Lid I-5 could do that would also be fabulous would be to provide community uses, park uses that aren't practical in Freeway Park, given its likely national landmark status, and given sort of just the scale of its spaces. So the Lid could provide recreational spaces or real playgrounds or other amenities that draw more people into the vicinity of Freeway Park, and also let those people explore Freeway Park as an incredible place.
More traditional playgrounds.
Yes. Yes, more traditional playgrounds.
So, Charles, you spoke about people falling in love again with the park, and I think one of the people who was instrumental in making that happen is here tonight, David Brewster, and he asked a question: is the goal to create a popular park or a Halpern Memorial? And then he challenges us: you need to choose.
The popular park would be a Halpern Memorial. It's not it's a false dichotomy.
Well, I guess I since I don't live here anymore, I see you all here, but I wonder what the general love level is for Freeway Park in Seattle. It seems to me that the love needs to be divined again, or the romance needs to be rekindled. And I think I can point to what we did in Portland as an example of that, although I think it's very, very different, and I'm not sure if the same sort of storylines or the strength of the storylines are there here. But we started out over 10 years ago with a huge sequential performance through the plazas, divining, actually doing a bit of work pre-Alison in terms of looking at the relationship between Lawrence Halpern and his wife, and we created a series of dance performances on an afternoon, and brought over 1,000 people out, and got a lot of press around that. That effort grew into a book about the plazas, which ultimately grew into an exhibition and historic National Register of Historic Places nomination, and a stronger Halpern Conservancy, which grew into a local improvement district with the surrounding property owners agreeing to tax themselves in order to provide the money for the restoration. And so it was a slow accumulation of rekindling the romance with them. And how many people, throughout this whole effort, it's like, I didn't even know these existed, in the city, even though, of course, landscape architects, it's very, celebrated all over the world. And I think that, I love the work that the association is doing, I mean, it's amazing. I wish we had that in our plazas. We did a great job of doing capital improvements to it, but we haven't done a good job of figuring out how to program them. And so that's a great start, but I think there has to be something maybe bigger. I don't know. Like I say, I don't live here, but that's how I think about it. It's like, how do you create the story of these plazas, you know, of this park in a way that is going to make people fall in love with it? That has to be a constantly renewed process with something, I think, particularly as peculiar as this park is. You know, I mean, it's an acquired taste. You know, particularly during the winter, like we were there today. You know, if you brought somebody who'd never been there before, I think they'd be pretty puzzled by it. You know, and that it's an icon of landscape architect if they're not, you know, amongst us. So how do we tell that story? How do we make people believe in it? I think is a real question here.
Charles, Ian wants to get in trouble again.
Yeah, well, with David Brewster, you know, we're meeting in town hall.
Could you use your microphone?
We're meeting in town hall, not in the David Brewster Memorial, but it is also memorial to David Brewster, and I think you can have it both ways.
Well, I think it's been fun for me as an observer to see everything that's happened in Portland, which is a great success story. And even before the Conservancy was there, Halpern himself was brought back in to do a report in the 1990s. It was called Recapture the Magic. And it actually started with pruning. It was basically, the first thing was, let's get the views open. Look at the Central Park Conservancy. You know, when you look at the work that started under Betsy Rogers or Tupper Thomas in Prospect Park, you know, they often said that it took 25 years to build these parks, and it's going to take 25 years to put them back together again. And I feel that we're in a similar situation here, and I think that clock started ticking for this park more than a decade ago. And, you know, I think the backdrop that we have to remember is that landscape architecture is still a burgeoning art form whose recognition is increasing. The capping of freeways is just one example. You know, I think back when the conversation that we're having tonight actually wouldn't have happened. It didn't happen in the case of, say, Occidental Park, in the context of Ilsa Jones' magnificent and glorious structure that she created in that project. And that was a sacrificial lamb in a project that needed to move forward for a lot of the same reasons we're talking about here this evening. And I think what's different about this conversation specifically is the foundation for the values that we're putting forward tonight. And those values are myriad and they're complex, and in some cases we can be provocative about them. But the reality is we're having that conversation, and I think we should see that we're on that the 50th anniversary of this design is actually not that far away. I mean, you're going to be bringing your great-grandchildren there, Kenny, I'm guessing at this point. And, you know, when it... You've got 7 years, buddy. But in all seriousness, I don't think that that's unrealistic to think that that we could see a very renewed, refreshed, restored, and rehabilitated park for its 50th anniversary.
I wanted to respond. I was extremely irritated by the question, but I think that's why it was asked. I don't think this is I mean, I agree that it's a false dichotomy. I don't think this is about hero worship of the designer by any means. I think this is about a meaningful experience in the city that if it disappears, it would be unfortunate for the city to have lost that meaningful experience that you have. I mean, it's right here. Obviously, it's highly degraded in terms of, you know, the integrity of the place, and I think part of it is some of the later additions, and I think that, you know, some of the suggestions that Lara made in the beginning would make a really big difference in terms of bringing that message back together. But I certainly don't think this is about creating a memorial to Halpern. I think it's about realizing and appreciating a moment in your urban fabric that is unique and unique nationally. And I think it's not really a memorial to Halpern, it's a memorial to the city's development, the history of urban development in the US. I mean, I think that there's so much to it, and it tells that story, but I think it needs to be told. I mean, it can't tell it on its own. I mean, it needs some narrators, it needs some help, and I mean, that's very clear. But I certainly don't think that this is about, you know, Halpern as a sort of hero designer and us memorializing him. But I do, I mean, despite, you know, it might never be, you know, a great civic space, but that was never the intention. I don't know what you mean by a popular park wherever you are, but the idea is, you know, it's a unique experience, and it would be really too bad to lose it.
Well, we've heard a laundry list of needs and a laundry list of desires, which always ends up being a question, also of resources. We know that this project has about $6 million in capital funds. Lara presented that earlier. What would you spend that first $6 million on? One vote for plants.
Related to what Randy was saying, I would spend some proportion of it on letting people in the city know about the park, knowing where it is, essentially a kind of advertising campaign in a variety of places, on the light rail that I took from the airport, on the buses, on the streets, on kiosks, in hotels, in public schools. I asked the question earlier, do public schools take field trips there? It strikes me as a magnificent site for field trips. The tourist buses go by it. I don't know the answer to those things, but I'd, you know, in a sense, advertising the park as a way to get started. And that's relatively cheap compared to, let's say, any of the repairs that are necessary, or in terms of planting. Planting, by the way, is not that expensive.
I would start with the fountains. If you build it, they will come. And I think you just look at those historic photographs. I think that the fountains are part of a rebranding campaign and a series of events, and like the one that Randy did with Frozen Dance in Portland, it was really, it was a happening. It was sort of something that you never forget. And I think it, in a nano moment, changed the way people looked at that place, and it burgeoned all these new relationships between the city and that landscape. And I think that that Freeway Park has that same potential.
I think you need to find more money. I have no idea if how deeply the surrounding property owners have been engaged, but local improvement district can do a lot of good. With rents where they are, it seems like probably various tenants could absorb a little more in their triple net, to make that park better, to bring a few more million. Because $6 million isn't going to buy much. I mean, we spent $4.5 million on a much smaller project, and you can't even see what we did, really. Other than lights, we restored lights. And if you really looked at the fountains all the time, you would recognize that we replaced the pumps, and there's much more robust water flow in them. But other than that, there's not a bit of visible change to it. As far as the $6 million goes, I think that a lot of what needs to be done is to rekindle the magic at night, and so I think a really good lighting scheme, and probably one that isn't going to be exactly as Halpern designed it. I was talking to the lighting guy in the back, and I think there's a lot of inventive ways to bring out the theatricality of the water and the landscape and the plantings, and I would really concentrate on really conjuring the magic there.
I don't know. I mean, I've said my priorities. I don't want to keep repeating myself, but I do think that there are potential partnerships that are not about necessarily generating funds, but generating more support, about telling that story, about activating the space. I mean, this is what, obviously I'm not from here, so I'm coming in as an outsider, so who am I to speak? But I'm given this platform. So, I was down at Olympic Sculpture Park yesterday, and it is, obviously it has a different patron in a way. It has a patron. It's not a I think it's a public land, but it's overseen by the museum. But why there aren't connections to the museum to this other design space, I mean, I think that there's so much potential there. I mean, I don't know, the Seattle Museum of Art, I think, could be a really interesting partner with trying to raise visibility, talk about design in the city. And I also think the Arboretum, I mean, the park is intended to be a reference to sort of old growth forest that disappeared in First Hill area with its seeps and springs. And clearly, I mean, the plants were chosen for their pollution hardiness, but and tolerance. But I think that there's some really interesting sort of urban trees to be studied here that I think could create a really interesting program that might connect to what Kenny was saying in terms of field trips. That this could be a real learning area as well. So I mean, I think that there's, it's not about how to spend the money, but I think that there's other people that I think can be drawn into this process to sort of strengthen the visibility and the story that's being told.
All amazing thoughts and a challenge for Lara and her team and for Seattle Parks. I'd like to invite everyone to please put your hands together and thank our panelists this evening.